The US currently has 3,700 nuclear warheads in its arsenal, while Russia has around 5,900. What would happen if both of these countries were to use them? Scientists from Princeton University created a simulation of this exact scenario, and it paints a grim picture. But if you thought that this was just a fun science experiment, you'd be wrong. There were many moments in history where this simulation could have become reality. So join us as we take a look at this hypothetical future, as well as the secret plans of the US in case of World War III. 90 million dead in the first few hours. That's what the simulation predicts. The Science and Global Security Lab at Princeton created a simulation that explored the potential consequences of a nuclear war involving the United States and Russia. They gave particular consideration to the role played by the current fleet of 400 on-alert silo-based ICBMs in US nuclear strategy. The United States is planning to replace its aging fleet of Minuteman III missiles, which have been in service since the early 1970s, with a new generation known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, intended to remain operational until 2075. The simulation shows the catastrophic outcomes of nuclear conflict involving the arsenals and strategic plans of both the United States and Russia. The simulation evaluates the outcomes of nuclear warfare under varying assumptions. The attack scenarios are limited by the size and capabilities of existing nuclear arsenals and weapon systems, taking into account factors such as the range of delivery vehicles. It also takes into account the layout of multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles and the ability to neutralize hardened targets. The simulation tool even incorporates an atmospheric model to assess the spread of nuclear fallout in each attack scenario. The simulation was then presented in the form of a 4-minute audio-visual piece titled Plan A. The video illustrates an escalating conflict between the United States and Russia, utilizing realistic assessments of nuclear force postures, targets, and estimated casualties. The scenario takes place in the context of a conventional conflict between NATO and Russia, where nuclear warning shots are given to each side, with the number of nukes and their severity increased by the hour. The targets of nukes are shifted from the conflict zone and are aimed at military bases instead, with casualties rising to 2.6 million over the course of 3 hours. Then the final escalation. Mutually assured destruction. The US launched its entire arsenal of warheads on Russia. Russia replies in turn before the missiles even land. The end result is 91.5 million immediate casualties. But if you were to account for the long-term effects of nuclear fallout, food shortages, diseases, and other factors, that number would surely be much higher. This grim simulation could have become a reality many times in the past, even back when the first atomic bombs were used. In the early days of August, American warplanes dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 Japanese citizens. Subsequently, many more would succumb to injuries and illnesses linked to the atomic blasts. This unprecedented devastation played a pivotal role in compelling Japan to surrender during World War II, while also revealing the extraordinary might of this new category of weapon. But did you know that the US wasn't going to stop at 2 nuclear bombs? The perception that 2 atomic bombs would suffice emerged only after the war had concluded. A wave of memoirs by individuals involved in the Manhattan Project began to assert that it was widely known that 2 atomic bombs would be adequate. However, before the devastating attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the prevailing consensus was that 2 bombs alone would not be enough to bring about Japan's surrender. This viewpoint was shared by the 2 leaders overseeing the Manhattan Project, General Groves and Oppenheimer. A mere 3 days after the Trinity test, General Groves corresponded with Oppenheimer, indicating that it would be essential to deploy both Little Boy and Fat Man, and potentially even 2 more Fat Man bombs. The pilot of the plane responsible for dropping Little Boy, Colonel Paul Tibbets, provided varying accounts of the situation. His earliest recollection suggested that it would require 5 atomic bombs to compel Japan's surrender. He had at his disposal 15 bombers and trained crew, prepared to drop additional atomic bombs if the need arose during the ongoing conflict. But Japan surrendered, and no more bombs were dropped. However, even after the war ended, the West planned for the next one. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States and Great Britain, formerly Soviet allies, devised military plans to dismantle the USSR through a massive nuclear attack on its cities. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill initiated Operation Unthinkable before the war's end, contemplating the Allied invasion of Russia-held Europe in July 1945 to impose the will of the United States and the British Empire. However, British generals cautioned against the hazards of total war against the USSR. After the United States used atomic bombs in Japan, Churchill and American policymakers advocated for a nuclear strike on the USSR, arguing it would bring down the Kremlin while sparing US and British military casualties. This led to the Pentagon's development of first strike plans targeting the USSR without harming the United States. The 1949 Drop Shot Plan envisaged an attack involving 300 nuclear bombs and 20,000 tons of conventional bombs targeting 200 locations across 100 urban areas. It also proposed a ground campaign with European allies for a complete victory over the Soviet Union, set for January 1, 1957. It wasn't the potential for civilian casualties or the sheer absurdity of the plan that stopped these countries from going through with it. Their hesitance stemmed from the lack of nukes and planes at their disposal. At the time, the US only had 50 atomic bombs, and they only possessed 32 B-29 bombers to carry said bombs. The US was about to go through with the plan after increasing their bomb count to 250. With this many nukes, the Pentagon was confident that the US would achieve complete victory over Russia. However, the USSR's successful atomic bomb test in August 1949 threw a wrench in the plans of the United States. US intelligence estimated that the Soviets were at least 3 years away from obtaining nuclear technology, but their estimates were wrong, prompting further changes to the plan. In 1960, the United States formalized its nuclear war plans through the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. Initially, the SIOP outlined a massive simultaneous nuclear strike against the USSR, including its nuclear forces, military targets, cities, China, and Eastern Europe. It involved nearly 3,500 atomic warheads, potentially resulting in the deaths of 285 to 425 million people, with some of the USSR's European allies facing complete destruction. Under the Kennedy administration, the plan was altered to avoid targeting Soviet cities, focusing solely on their nuclear forces. Although modified in 1962, it still acknowledged the potential loss of millions of civilians. This aggressive stance fueled a nuclear arms race, prompting the USSR to strengthen its nuclear capabilities. The dangerous competition between the US and the USSR intensified the nuclear arms race. Unfortunately, history's lessons seem unheeded, as the world almost faced destruction in 1962. During the Cold War in October, US reconnaissance flights uncovered secret Soviet missile bases in Cuba, nearly pushing the world to nuclear conflict. President John F. Kennedy issued a stern warning to Moscow, threatening a full retaliatory nuclear response if a nuclear attack was launched from Cuba against any Western Hemisphere country. A 13-day standoff followed, including a US naval quarantine of Cuba. The world was almost engulfed in a nuclear war thanks to this situation. Two critical incidents transpired on October 27, 1962, a day often considered one of the most perilous in history. In the morning, a U-2F reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by the Soviets, intensifying tensions. Later that day, a Soviet submarine, the B-59, attempted to breach the US Navy's Cuban blockade. The USS Beale dropped practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface. The B-59's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed they were under attack and prepared a nuclear torpedo to launch at the USS Randolph aircraft carrier. Launching required agreement from all senior officers on board. Thankfully, the B-59's second-in-command Vasily Arkhipov dissented, persuading the captain to surface and await Moscow's orders, averting a potential catastrophe. In September 1983, Soviet satellite operators at the Sepakov 15 bunker received a warning of a US Minuteman nuclear missile launch. Tensions had escalated due to the earlier downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007. Stanislav Petrov, the commanding officer, faced a dilemma. follow protocol and report the launches for a retaliatory strike, or trust his instincts. Petrov chose not to inform superiors, believing that if the US were attacking, it would involve more than 5 missiles. His decision was a high-stakes gamble. After 23 anxious minutes, it was confirmed as a false alarm. The satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds as missiles. Then, in 1995, Russian radars detected a missile launch off Norway's coast resembling a Trident missile. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's president, was alerted, and the nuclear briefcase was readied. Fortunately, it was a Norwegian scientific rocket studying the aurora borealis, and Yeltsin's belief in a false alarm was vindicated, averting a potential nuclear crisis. Fast forward to the current day, and the situation is not any better. The doomsday clock was set at 90 seconds to midnight. The doomsday clock is a metaphor that represents how close humanity is to a global catastrophe of their own creation. The latest setting of the doomsday clock is the closest it's ever been in history. The last time it was set was in 2020, and it was placed at 100 seconds before midnight. This decrease of 10 seconds is thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war represents the potential for escalation. The risk of nuclear war in our current decade cannot be ignored. A diplomatic solution rests on the shoulders of each nation's respective leader. Whether we will arrive at that hopeful future is anyone's guess, but do you believe that nuclear war can be prevented in the near future? Let us know what you think the future has in store for us, and be sure to leave a like for more.